results quite justified the vagaries of the investigation, even if the essentials of his work methods escaped them. According to mood or to the conversations and circumstances of the moment, which might inspire either jumpiness or relaxation, someone could be a positivist one day and a cloud shoveler the next, or vice versa. Only Adamsberg and Dongland, the two principal antagonists, never varied their position. So I hope we can be a positivist one day and a cloud shoveler the next day also. Thank you very much. Would anybody like any questions? Bruno Zevi, Richard Brautigan, Kurt Vonnegut, Alvar Aalto. Any questions? If there are no questions, it's a rule of the reading that I'm allowed to recommend you go away and read some books if there are no questions. So I would suggest you go and look at Timequake by Kurt Vonnegut. Super for some of your students. Trout Fishing in America by Richard Brautigan. File Under Architecture by Herbert Moucham. And I'm just thinking of which. And yes, if you would like to return back, have a look at my book, Altomania, because I think you will understand a lot of things that become fictional in someone's life when the critics start working on the life and just taking it beyond the reach of the person. And Aalto's archive now is in that land of that Netherland, which is now becoming fictional, because the memory to the first hand, second hand, third hand has gone. So the next books on Aalto will become more fictional, rightly or wrongly. They will take their own approach, as with many other architects too. Anybody interested in looking at the long philosophical poem? It's called Welcome to the Hotel Architecture, and it's MIT Press. Yeah, some of you probably don't know. Again, those sitting in the cheap seats know people like. How many have heard of Juhani Palasma? No. Well, a few. Okay. You know, life goes on. I was writing a book in 2004, Finland. It's the modern. The history of modern architectures in history, it's called, and there are many from different countries, and this is on Finland. And there was a picture of a little piglet that had been released in a lecture, this little piglet with the letters S-A-F-A on the piglet. It was really cute. I mean, really cute. And I thought, this is really interesting picture. It's in the Museum of Finnish Architecture's archives. So I went and found out that this Safa, in the words S-A-F-A, means Finland, Suomen architecture, Finnish architecture in Swedish. So it means the Finnish Architecture Association, the two languages, acronym, Safa. So I put this in the book for the London publisher, and of course you'll guess, the one photograph she wanted to take out of the book was the piglet. And I thought, why would you? She said, well, I don't think the piglet's very relevant. I said, the piglet was super relevant to the militants in the 1968, 69, 70, because the piglet was, some of you remember the Miami Convention and then the Chicago Convention, where the pigs North American parlance, of course, means police, coppers. So the pig was a copper, was the police. So they had those little pigs released in the Chicago convention. So this, I found this story very interesting. So I thought, okay, if you leave that piglet away from the history, we've lost a whole history. And of course the editor thought I was completely bonkers. You know, what do you mean you've lost a history when you... So I thought, okay, I'll write a book about that piglet. So I found the piglet had been released in a meeting where Alvar Aalto was speaking to young architects and engineers. And it was released by a person, Tapani Launis, you won't know the name, but I know the person, I know who it was, he's now 72. So I interviewed the man who released the piglet in 1970, and he'd been in Paris in 1968 and seen the things going on here, and they took it back, and he rode his motorbike back to Finland, and he thought, well, I'll do something radical, and I'll release a piglet in this lecture. Well, I said, well, what happened? And he said, well, it was all so cute. They all thought it was so funny that even Alvar Aalto, they were all just running after this little piglet, and it didn't cause any radical break. It was not a militant act. I was not thrown out, and it was just completely embarrassing. And we just had to pick the piglet up and take him back to the farmer that we'd borrowed him from and scrub the letters off. And I thought that was a very nice story for the kind of the beginning and the end of the militancy in Finnish architecture. There was a little more militancy in Finnish architecture, but that was the book is called The Piglet Years, and it is about the armchair Marxism and the militancy in Finnish architecture between the years 1968 and 1973. But to answer you, I can get in Finland by the back door. It's okay. Like many things I went to work with Reima Pietri in 1974. Like a country like Finland, when you have big men, women, but in this case it was men, Sibelius, it's like a huge tree casting a shadow, and music doesn't develop. The young architects felt the same with Alvar Aalto in 1950s, and Pietala always used this metaphor that Aalto is like this big tree casting this shadow, and people are trying to get out of the shadow. They're a bit afraid to get out of the shadow because they have to work on their own. So Pietala was younger than Aalto, but in between the rationalists, if I call them the rationalists from that time. So Pietala respected Aalto, but had to find a way out of the shadow, out of the shade of the tree. For me to would take a long time, but Pietala was a Finn in the way that communication was very very special. He was one of the cloud shovelers from Fred Vargas. He was not one of the positivists, and he worked through the ambiguity to get to his architecture. Aalto was very much the Fred Vargas both. Aalto could be the positivist and the cloud shoveler. Aalto was very, very, very clear, the binary logic in his work. So Pietala became a figure in Finnish architecture to represent this kind of the unbounded architecture that could have come out of a kind of expressionism which was not developed or was a kind of a lost period in modernism. Pietala often went back to people like Hugo Herring and discussed Hugo Herring as a kind of lost figure in architecture, and there are others. Alto was not so much mainstream, but Alvar Aalto was very much, in a way, he became part of the club. But you have to remember that Aalto was brought into the club in the 30s by Siegfried Gideon, who saw Aalto's kind of what he called then in the 1939 edition of Space, Time and Architecture. I mean, he kind of called it the Romantic tradition, which was mislabeled in a way, but he identified the humanist strain in Aalto, which allowed him to reposition some of his work in Space, Time and Architecture. So Aalto entered into sort of mainstream architecture, the Zeitgeist theory and Gideon's work from 1939, the New York Pavilion and Villa Mairea, which had the notion of the curved form against the rectilinear. Pietola often echoed that, but tried to work in a let's say perhaps a more original way. That's perhaps not the right phrase, but tried to explore a much more fluid type of architecture, which wasn't particularly popular in the 60s, because in Finland there was a much more rationalist. They called themselves the structuralists in Finland, which was not the structuralism from Aldo van Eyck or Holland, but it was a different type of structuralism they were. And Pietola was always kind of on the outside, in the margin. So if you look through his work, and I collaborated on many of them, but if you look through his work, there's some sort of incredibly imaginative parts in the work, and then sometimes you'll come across something that maybe is a little bit uncomfortable, and you're not sure why that fits together. Aalto wouldn't have dealt with the architecture that way. Pietro allowed these accidents to become, in a way, his architecture, and was pretty much attacked for it at the time. In the 60s, he was pretty much isolated. Aalto was first isolated. Aalto was called the capitalist's lackey, because when the armchair Marxists wanted, that's why they wanted to release the pig, because Aalto had become friends with the Enzo Gutzeit, the owners, the mill owners, and therefore he had the big buildings, and he started building in Helsinki. Right up until Finlandia Hall, 1975, the big marble concert hall, and then the conference center. That was not treated well at all in the 70s. There's an interesting, and it's more than an anecdote, that the Finnish School of Architecture in Otaniemi, which is out of Helsinki Technical University, would not allow slides of Aalto's work in the late 50s and 60s. There's a reason why that happens. The people who were involved with teaching, again, the names, you won't know them, but there's certain people. There was a very strong, I think these camps work in, I'm sure the camps are in New York, the camps are in Paris, as in London, but there was Alvar Aalto's office, there was Ervi's office. Some of you know Arni Ervi. Ervi's was the business office, Aalto's was the cultural office, and Helsinki is a small city. So and then the younger architects played which side they were on, and they would go to the different offices. And then there was the inner group, Blomstedt, which goes as a famous name in Finnish architecture, and Blomstedt was a sort of, I would say, a kind of mystical rationalist, but he would consider himself a rationalist and would have nothing to do with Aalto and have nothing to do with Ervi. So you had this inner line, which then became the line that out of that became the architecture that Palasma, there are names, Gulliksen, came the younger Finns. And Pietola was also left outside of this because he was far too radical, far too expressive for them. They didn't think this was architecture. It was just it was harking back to national romanticism. But Pietola was extraordinary because he was probably the most effective singular critic of Finnish architecture for 20 years. He wrote enormous amount, and he wasn't afraid of taking them on. So it would be a great research for anyone, because there's no architect I have known has practiced and actually been a pioneering critic at the same time. So he's very extraordinary for that, and he wrote his work as, he wrote his as menus. He would write a menu and turn it into a lecture. He had a lot more humor. So he was a very humorous man. Almost at times, I would say Dadaistic. To some extent, Pietola could be, but now I'm going into more detail. For me, it's an opportunity. I mean, we travel the world, so I mean, it is incredible, and any of you know the diffidence and the halting way sometimes Finns speak. They have difficulty sometimes speaking. Therefore, me with Pietola, it was like theatre, and I think it was also a disguise. He didn't like public speaking, so we did it together quite often. One performance, we were coming on the train from Helsinki. Some of you know the Alvar Aalto Symposium. There's a symposium every 2 years, I think, in Jyväskylä. And we were coming on the train and Pietola was supposed to speak in this symposium. Now, how many architects would do this? He had his text, and then he said to me, why don't you read my part of the text, and then I'll question you. And I'm thinking, are you sure this is a good idea in front of, international visitors and things? Because, so he said, no, this is okay. And he said, why don't you sit in the auditorium with a torch so that you shine it on your face? And and he loved these sort of things. So there we were, all these Illuminati coming from, and Peter's sitting there, and then he's asking me to interrupt him from the audience. So I've got this torch, and I'm shining it to my knife and saying, excuse me, Mr. Pietola, you said this, and of course, then he plays the actor and double takes me, so I don't know where I am in the script, because he's in control of the script. So this was pure drama, and this was so super. I've never seen anyone do this. And then suddenly, he just folded and finished, and I was left in mid-sentence in the audience. And then he went off the stage, and I thought, oh my God, what do we do? So I, stopped it. Then I went downstairs, and I saw him, and we were in Alvar Aalto's building in Jyväskylä, and we went to the restroom. I said, what happened? He said, I was dying for a piss. I had to stop this lecture. And that's the sort of, I know they're anecdotes, but you learn a lot from that person, from those sort of things.